to say here at Gettysburg. All right, well, I got 7:02, so let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all here to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Dan Welch. I'm a park ranger here at Gettysburg, and this is our special campfire this evening. We're having two very special weekends here at Gettysburg this weekend and the last weekend of October. We're calling Fall into History, and we're offering some extra battle walks. Those are 2-hour in-depth walking tours on different units of the battle, and we're offering some of our campfire programs, which are nice evening lectures on various Civil War topics related to Gettysburg or Civil War. Our full schedule of that is on our park website, on our social media, on the National Park Service app. If you download that, it's all in there. We hope to see you on many of those programs. In addition to that, we have our regular scheduled programs this weekend as well, so don't miss out on your chance tomorrow if you're still with us to hike a little round top with a ranger, explore the National Cemetery with a park ranger, and many, many other programs. If you have any questions about those, please feel free to see me at the end of the program. Well, tonight we are going to talk about another one of those mythologied or storied units here at the Battle of Gettysburg and during the American Civil War, and it's that of the Iron Brigade. Now, the Iron Brigade is perhaps one of the most famous units of the Union Army, this particular army, which is the Army of the Potomac. It's right up there with perhaps the Irish Brigade that fights here at Gettysburg as well. And one of the things that happens when these units or these people, these historical figures, become very popular within the American consciousness is that this whole web of mythology is built up around them. And they get put up on these pedestals, and we forget to look beyond just that surface level and really discover the true stories that are so foundational to that overall ethos in mythology. And the Iron Brigade is no different. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Iron Brigade in one way or the other, whether it be related to their fight here at Gettysburg, or maybe you've seen the movie Gettysburg and you heard them referred to as those black-hatted fellows. They wore these hardy hats with the ostrich plumes, and they wore U.S. Army regular uniforms, long frock coats, much different than many of the other Union units. So maybe you know them about their distinctive dress that they've worn for about a year and a half by the time they get here to Gettysburg. Maybe you know a little bit more about them. You know something about the nickname that they have earned, the Iron Brigade. Although there's some contention by some New York soldiers that served in 1861 that said that was our unit's nickname, the men of the Iron Brigade will always contend that it was none other than previous Union Army of the Potomac commander George McClellan that gave them that nickname during the Battle of South Mountain on September the 14th, 1862. It was during that fighting that as McClellan is watching the engagement, he asks one of his staff nearby who those troops were out there in front of him fighting. And when he was told that it was John Gibbon's Western Brigade, McClellan claims he later responded, quote, "They must be made of iron." And there they had earned the moniker, the Iron Brigade. So maybe you know something about their distinctive uniforms. Maybe you know something about their nickname that becomes so widely known in the scholarship of the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg. Perhaps if you know something about their service here at Gettysburg itself, you may know that the Iron Brigade took heavy losses on the first day of the battle west of the town of Gettysburg, out in McPherson's Woods or Herbst Woods, and another location known as the Railroad Cut. The losses that they sustained are firmly recorded as some of the worst losses of any Civil War units during the entirety of the Civil War itself. The Iron Brigade proportionally suffered the most casualties of any brigade during the entirety of the Civil War. For example, the Iron Brigade here at Gettysburg suffered 61% casualties as a brigade. The 2nd Wisconsin, part of the Iron Brigade, suffered 77% casualties on July 1st, and that was the 3rd highest total percentage loss throughout the entire war. Right behind them was the 24th Michigan on that sad statistical legacy, who had lost a substantial number of men here at Gettysburg as well. During their fight west of town, primarily, some losses later at Culp's Hill, but primarily they're fighting on July 1st. In the 2nd Wisconsin alone, 3 out of 4 of every man in the ranks became a casualty. In the 6th and 7th Wisconsin regiments, 1 out of every 2 in the ranks became a casualty. The 19th Indiana, 3 out of 4 men in the ranks, a casualty. And in the 24th Michigan, 4 out of every 5 men in that regiment was a casualty of the battle. It was the highest total of any federal regiment in the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Iron Brigade on the morning of July 1st, before they engaged in combat, brought 1,883 men into battle. At the end of July 1st, as they retreated through the town of Gettysburg and ultimately took position on the northeastern slope of Culp's Hill, only 671 reported for duty. It was a loss of 64.3%. But even that number, 671, may be a little high when we talk about the survivors. The brigade quartermaster for the Iron Brigade said when he went to issue rations to the men of the Iron Brigade at the end of the fighting of July 1st at Culp's Hill, he only had to issue rations for 500, making that percentage loss even higher. So when we talk about the Iron Brigade, and we talk about their distinctive uniforms, we talk about that moniker that they have earned by George McClellan for their fierce fighting capabilities on numerous battlefields in 1862 and leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And we talk about the sad statistical legacy that heavy fighting left behind. We often lose the distinctiveness of who these men were that comprised the Iron Brigade. So tonight we are going to move beyond the sobriquet, and we are going to learn about 7 individuals, 7 men who signed up to go off to war in 1861, who survived the horrors of many other battlefields in the 2 years of their service before reaching Gettysburg. What happened to them on these fields west of the town on the morning of July 1st, and how they lived out the remainder of their years. We're going to start tonight with a soldier from the 19th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, Color Sergeant Burlington Cunningham. Surprisingly, Burlington Cunningham was not born or from Indiana originally. He was born in Front Royal, which is in Warren County, Virginia, on August 4th, 1841. He was the son of a carpenter, and the family eventually moved to Indiana in 1855, just 6 years before the war broke out. In 1861, Cunningham was residing in Delaware County, Indiana, and many of his comrades would eventually call him Burl. Burl would enlist as a private in Company K of the 19th Indiana Infantry on July 29, 1861. At Antietam, Cunningham was wounded while he rescued the colors of his regiment from the field. Seeing the regiment's color bearers shot and the flag down, Cunningham declared, quote, "The flag shall not fall into the hands of its enemies. I will rescue it or die in the attempt." He successfully was able to get the colors of the 19th Indiana and get them off the battlefield that day on September 17, 1862. His reward for that act was promotion to corporal on November the 12th, and the honor of carrying the 19th Indiana's national colors. His story is just one that we will hear this evening of the men that comprise the Iron Brigade. Another young man to join the Iron Brigade is Lieutenant Gilbert A. Dickey. Dickey was born in February of 1843. He was from Marshall, Michigan, which is part of Calhoun County. One of the interesting things to note about Gilbert Dickey was that he was part of the first graduating class from the Agricultural College of the state of Michigan in East Lansing in 1861. You know it today as Michigan State University.
Go Green.
Whoa. I'm a native Ohioan. That hurts my feelings. So Dickie is part of the first graduating class from this college in East Lansing in 1861. He's 18 years old. And in September of 1861, he goes off to serve his country. General John C. Fremont, who was the commander of the Department of the West for the Union Army's war effort, began to shape a special unit in the Western Theater, a special signal corps unit. It required men knowledgeable in the fields of physics, chemistry, and surveying. Fremont commissioned a professor by the name of E.P. Howland, a Michigan native, to recruit this group of specialized individuals, or skilled engineers. Howland would recruit the unit in Battle Creek, Michigan, 50 miles southwest of Lansing, and dubbed them Howland's Independent Company, also known as the Michigan Engineers or Howland's Engineers. 6 out of 7 of the seniors of Gilbert Dickey's graduating class made the cut to be able to join this specialized unit upon application. They would fortify cities along the Mississippi River. They would guard substantial amounts of money. Unfortunately, this specialized unit operated outside of the Federal Army standards and was thus out of service standards. And on January 8, 1862, they were ordered disbanded by General Henry Halleck. So Dickey has now had some war experience, and he's out of a job. He returns back to Michigan, and he marries his sweetheart, Rosetta, on July 1st, 1862. Think about that. Just a year later, he is here, fighting west of the town of Gettysburg. Just a month after being married, at the ripe old age of 19, he enlists in the 24th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He quickly rises through the ranks, making commissary sergeant by December of 1862, sergeant major in January of 63, and just 2 months later, second lieutenant of Company G, the post he held as he led his men to the battlefield here at Gettysburg on July the 1st. Colonel Henry A. Morrow, the commanding officer of the 24th Michigan, would later describe Dickey, quote, Lieutenant Dickey joined the regiment in the capacity of commissary sergeant, and for his integrity, capacity, and attention to the business was promoted to the rank of sergeant major, and thence to second lieutenancy. He had given great promise for his usefulness and distinction. A fellow classmate and brother in arms, George Hay, said, quote, there was never a word of fault with his work. Another soldier that found himself joining the 24th Michigan was Color Sergeant Abel Peck. When we think about the soldiers that served in the American Civil War, we often think that this is a war of young boys, drummer boys, 12, 14 years old, men like Dickey serving in the ranks, ages 18, 19. But not all of those that signed up in 1861 to fight this conflict, North and South, but in our case this evening for the Union Army, were so young. Color Sergeant Abel Peck was born in January of 1820 near Bethlehem, Connecticut. That's in Litchfield County, for any of you folks from Connecticut out there tonight. He was born into a large family. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. His family, as a young man, gets caught up in the westward movement, and they would eventually move to Oakland County, Michigan from Connecticut. He would take on the profession of a farmer in the pre-war decades. He was married twice before he enlisted in 1861. His first marriage was in 1846 at the age of 26. He married a woman by the name of Carolyn Sanford, and the union produced 2 daughters. Carolyn and another daughter, just over 2 months old, both died in childbirth. Abel would remarry not long after to a New York teacher named Mary Reed, and during the birth of his second daughter to Mary, both mother and newborn died. So here he is on the eve of the American Civil War, been married twice. He has lost 2 wives to childbirth and 2 daughters to childbirth. He has 2 daughters left, each without a mother. He would attend a mass meeting on Detroit's campus on July 15, 1862, to garner support for raising the 24th Michigan Volunteer Infantry from Wayne County, Michigan men. Albert Peck was one of those that enlisted within the first 4 days of this meeting. He was 42 years of age at the time of his enlistment, and he was to be the regiment's first color bearer, carrying those flags into battle. Because he was not only one of the first to sign up after this meeting and taking on the role of color bearer, he received $100 cash bounty upon his enlistment, which had been donated anonymously to anyone that volunteered to carry the flag into combat. He would officially be mustered into federal service on August 15, 1862. His commanding officer here at Gettysburg, Colonel Henry Morrow, would say of Peck that he was, quote, a man greatly admired for his almost saintly character. So we've heard about a soldier from the 19th Indiana. We've heard about 2 soldiers from the 24th Michigan. Now we're going to hear about some soldiers from the Wisconsin units that comprise the Iron Brigade. Lieutenant Colonel George H. Stevens was born in New York City in December of 1831. At the age of 17, he joined the 7th Regiment National Guard in response to the Astor Place riots in May of 1849. And if you can't sleep tonight, you want to learn about something interesting forgotten to American history, go to Google and type in the Astor Place riots. He would soon be promoted in that National Guard regiment to 4th Sergeant, and he would resign from the National Guard at age 21 in 1852. He grew restless in New York City, and he was seeking adventure. So he resigned from the National Guard, and I can't think of a better adventure than this in the 1850s, went all the way to Australia. He would spend the next 3 years of his life kind of drifting around Australia. But in 1855, he would return back to New York City. Upon his return to New York City, he would rejoin the 7th Regiment of the National Guard. Just a year later, in 1856, he moved to Milwaukee and went into business with an old friend and relative of the family. While in Milwaukee, he would join the Milwaukee Light Guard and Citizens Corps as orderly 1st Sergeant of Company B. 2 years later, he would move to Fox Lake, 45 miles northwest of Milwaukee, where he opened his own store. It was here that he met his future wife, Harriet Curdy. They married March 23rd, 1859, the marriage producing 2 children, a son and a daughter. In 1860, he would organize the Citizen Guard among local residents. And following the news of Fort Sumter, George would close his store. He turned to his brother on that fateful day and said, quote, "This is the last time I shall put up these shutters. The store is closed. Tomorrow I shall call a meeting of the Citizens Guard and find out how many will go with me to war." The Citizens Guard would form the nucleus of Company A of the 2nd Wisconsin. George Stevens would enlist in that unit on April 17, 1861, just 3 days after Fort Sumter had surrendered in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Stevens and his men would fight at the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, in July of 1861. A correspondent in the Sentinel speaks as follows of the actions in the First Battle of Bull Run, in particular to Stevens. Quote, "Captain George H. Stevens, who in addition to his many superior military accomplishments knows no such word as fail and cowardice, is not akin to his nature. His vocabulary contains no such feeling as fear, and he is collected, self-possessed, and undaunted bravery have been more than once tested. On the 21st of July, 1861, on the bloody plains of Bull Run, at the head of his company, he faced the lion in his lair and was among the last who reluctantly left the hotly contested field." George's own brother would afterwards write, quote, "He was said to be everywhere efficient as an officer, cool and self-possessed, brave, and patriotic under the most trying circumstances. A generous and earnest nature in whom the altogether too common fault of profanity was unknown. The colonel of the 2nd Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild, would say of Stevens, he was a clean man and a true soldier in every sense of the word. A year later, at the Battle of Second Bull Run, or Second Manassas, after the loss of the colonel of the 2nd Wisconsin and the wounding of the lieutenant colonel and major, the command of the regiment would devolve on Captain Stevens. Soon after that battle, Stevens became ill, and he would miss the bloodbath in the cornfield at Antietam on the morning of September 17, 1862, but he would quickly rejoin his company soon after. During the late fall of 1862, he would be promoted to major, and promoted again to lieutenant colonel early in 1863. Another soldier of the 2nd Wisconsin is Sergeant Cornelius Wheeler, another New York native. Wheeler was born in Medina, New York in September of 1840. As a boy, he came with his family to southwestern Wisconsin, where his father worked at various enterprises in Mineral Point and Dodgeville. During 1857 and 1858, Cornelius attended schools in Platteville, Wisconsin, and Meridian, New Hampshire. At the start of the American Civil War, Wheeler was a teacher. He was studying law in Dodgeville when his life would change drastically when he enlisted into the 2nd Wisconsin on May 20th of 1861. By the end of 1861, he had been promoted corporal and then to sergeant. After the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, he was promoted once again. He'd be promoted to first sergeant on May the 10th, 1863, just a little less than 8 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. Cornelius Wheeler saw action at numerous engagements in which the Iron Brigade took place. First Bull Run, Second Bull Run, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. Known to his friends as Corny, he was reckoned a, quote, noble, honorable soldier, serving his company and the command most faithfully. As we continue through the men of these Wisconsin regiments, I have two more to introduce you to this evening. The next is Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes. And this soldier holds a special place in my heart, particularly because we have Michigan fans in the audience. Rufus Dawes is from Ohio, from southeast Ohio. He was born on the 4th of July in 1838 in Malta, which is in Morgan County, Ohio. Now, Dawes came from a long lineage of family members that were in service to the country. Dawes was the great-grandson of William Dawes. A lot of people don't know today in the 21st century who William Dawes was. But everybody knows who Paul Revere was, right? Guess who rode with Paul Revere? William Dawes. Dawes' family has a long service of history to the country before the American Civil War. Much of Dawes' childhood would be spent in his grandfather's home near Marietta, where his mother found refuge following a legal separation from his father. Dawes has a pretty rough upbringing. Mom and dad divorced, which is pretty rare in the 1840s. Dad takes off to Wisconsin. Mom's going to move in with the grandparents in Marietta, Ohio. And Dawes and his siblings are going to be shuttled back and forth between southeast Ohio and Wisconsin in the 1840s and 1850s. Imagine what that would have been like for a young child and trying to do shared custody across such a large geographic expanse during that time period in American history. Eventually, Dawes, his father, would settle in Mauston, Wisconsin, and Rufus would join him there and would enter the University of Wisconsin in 1856. But just after 2 years at the University of Wisconsin, we don't know exactly what... Sorry about that. Just after 2 years at University of Wisconsin, we don't know exactly what happened, but Dawes decides to come back to Ohio. He will enroll in Marietta College, and he will obtain a degree from that institution in the class of 1860. Following his graduation, and even while he was at Marietta College, he would continue to work for his father back in Wisconsin during breaks from the institution. Following that graduation, Dawes would move to Juneau County, Wisconsin. And when the Civil War broke out just a year later, Dawes organized a volunteer unit and would be elected their captain in July of 1861. This would become Company K of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, which would serve for their first months of the war on guard duty in Washington, D.C. In June 1862, Dawes would be promoted to major. He would serve with his regiment at the Battle of Groveton, or Bronner Farm, the first part of the Battle of Second Bull Run, or Second Manassas, as well as at Antietam and Fredericksburg. In March of 1863, Dawes received a promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel and served in the Chancellorsville campaign. Our final soldier I'd like to introduce you to this evening is Sergeant Francis Jefferson Coates. Coates was born, one of the few native-born Wisconsiners that we're talking about tonight, in 1843 in Grant County, Wisconsin. He was the oldest of 3 children born to parents William and Cynthia. He was a farmer by trade, which was the family business stretching back for generations. He was living in Boscobel, Wisconsin, when the war broke out in 1861. Coates enlisted with the 7th Wisconsin on August the 26th, 1861, just 2 days after he turned 18. He would muster in as corporal in September of 1861 in Company H. Within a year, he was promoted to sergeant. His first time in combat was during the fighting at Second Manassas at Bronner Farm. He would be wounded at South Mountain just several weeks after that, and would not return back to the regiment till June of 1863, just weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. We spent time this evening very quickly introducing you to these 7 men. And you may have noticed I chose individuals who all had photos. You could see what they looked like. That they were more than just this mythic unit, more than just part of the Iron Brigade. That these were young men and old men, recent college graduates, husbands, fathers, farmers, teachers. They all had lives like you and me. And when the opportunity to serve their country came up, they took it. And between 1861 and the Battle of Gettysburg, these men went through shared experiences. Not only did that combat earn them their legendary status and that nickname in September of 1862, the Iron Brigade, but it brought these men together in a way that even blood could not. And on the morning of July 1st, 1863, these units, the 19th Indiana, the 24th Michigan, the 2nd, the 6th, and the 7th Wisconsin, would all go into combat, triggering a day of horrific fighting and heroic combat experiences by these men. These men, Cunningham, Dickey, Peck, Stevens, Wheeler, Dawes, and Coates. One of the things that I started the program out tonight was telling you about the substantial loss that these units took during the fighting on July 1st. Another one of those elements that is built into this mythology of the Iron Brigade, that they're remembered for that enormous casualties that they sustained during the fighting here at Gettysburg. But the downside, or the dark side to that, is that they've become so well known for the casualties that people focus on the numbers or the percentages that they lost and not how it affected the men that you just learned about and that you were just introduced to. And so we're going to close the program this evening, the second half of the program, by looking at these same 7 men. What was their combat experience like on July 1st? And what were their lives like in the days, weeks, months, years, and decades after the Battle of Gettysburg? We'll go back to the first gentleman we talked about this evening, Color Sergeant Burlington Cunningham of the 19th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. Now, as the 19th Indiana advanced up the eastern side of McPherson's Ridge out there on the first day's battlefield, a passing staff officer called out to him not to unfurl the flag. Remember Burlingham? He's pictured there on the left of that image. He is the flag bearer. He is carrying the national colors of the 19th Indiana. And when these men are carrying these flags into combat, before they go into combat, they need to unshuck them. Basically, it's a large bag that goes over the flag. And as they're coming up the backside of McPherson's Ridge, before they go into combat, or before they become engaged with the enemy, a staff officer is riding by and tells Cunningham, do not unfurl those colors. Don't take the shuck off. Do not unfurl them. Because there is enemy, we've got reports that the enemy is in the woods on the other side of this ridge, on the other side of this crest, just opposite your front. If you go ahead and unfurl those colors, the enemy will hone in on us. They'll start firing at us. And the regiment is not ready yet to go into combat. So do not take that shuck off. Do not unfurl the colors. But as the regiment moved from column, lines of 4 men, into line of battle, shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep, Cunningham decided to ignore the staff officer. And he asked his comrade in the color guard, a man by the name of Abe Buckles, to encase the colors. Cunningham shook the flag free and immediately drew fire from the Confederates of Brigadier General James Archer's brigade on the western slope of McPherson Ridge. 1 bullet would hit Cunningham in his side, and he fell in Farmer John Herbst's wheat field unconscious. Abe Buckles of the color guard would pick up the flag, and the battle would sweep on. Now, following the Iron Brigade's morning combat, in which they were successful against Brigadier General James Archer's Confederate brigade, stretcher parties that were evacuating the wounded of the Iron Brigade towards temporary aid stations popping up in the town of Gettysburg, they all ignored Cunningham. They thought he was dead. But he wasn't. He was unconscious. And after laying there in that wheat field for several hours, he woke up and made his way to the rear for medical attention. Probably he went to the Lutheran seminary just behind their position, which was the closest field hospital to the front at that moment. Now, rather than remaining in the hospital, this guy took a bullet in the side. He's been unconscious for the last several hours. He gets himself, after he comes to, gets himself to the aid station. Rather than remaining there, he gets bandaged up and he makes his way back to his regiment, which has now changed position slightly in Herbst's Woods along McPherson's Ridge, excuse me. He finds the color guard, he finds his comrade Abe Buckles, says, I'll take my flag back, and he gets in position. And none too soon before the next wave of Confederate units attacked the Iron Brigade's position. This would include James Johnston Pettigrew's North Carolina Brigade. One of the early casualties of this second attack against the Iron Brigade's position in the 19th Indiana was Cunningham. He was hit again, this time a severe wound in his right leg. His comrade Abe Buckles would take the national color from him a second time that day, but Buckles too was wounded just minutes later. Cunningham would fall into Confederate hands temporarily when they overran his regiment's initial position. After the Confederate retreat from Gettysburg days later, he was evacuated to a hospital in Harrisburg to convalesce for the next 5 months. While he was there, he met Private William L. Bingman of the 20th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and the 2 men had their photograph taken sometime in November or December of 1863. And that's the photograph you see there, pictured on the left of your screen. One of the interesting things about that photograph, if you were to look closely at Burl Cunningham, you can tell that he is leaning, holding himself up with 2 walking sticks. The descendants of Cunningham still own them, and that's a picture of them today that he used and had taken a picture of them with William Bingman of the 20th Pennsylvania Cavalry about 4 months after the battle. Now, Burl was a tough nut. Despite his 3 wounds in the war, he would serve out his enlistment in the 19th Indiana and he would be discharged in July of 1864 and returned home. He would begin receiving a veteran's pension for disability in October of 1879, and in 1880 he was listed as a farmer in Marion County, Iowa in the census. He moved to Wayne County, Nebraska to farm in about 1882 and was farming in Dixon County, Nebraska by 1900, and then went to Knox County, Nebraska in about 1902. He farmed there till at least 1910 and finally retired to Bloomfield, Nebraska in 1920. In 1930, he and his wife were still in Bloomfield, living independently in their own home and caring for their 10-year-old granddaughter, Luella Clark. He was 88 years old at the time. He would pass away in Nebraska later that year in 1930. Lieutenant Gilbert Dickey, part of that first graduating class of what becomes Michigan State University. Dickey would survive the morning combat that we just heard about with Burl Cunningham, with the Archer's Confederate Brigade. But right before the battle resumed in the afternoon of July 1st, Dickey sat down and started reading his Bible as his fellow classmate from that agricultural college and comrade in arms now over the last 2 years, George Hay, approached him and, quote, engaged him in a friendly conversation. It is likely that George Hay was the last person that Dickey talked to before the fighting resumed. During the afternoon fight between the Iron Brigade and James Johnston Pettigrew's North Carolina Brigade, at one point the 19th Indiana fell back, and it would expose the left end or the left flank of the 24th Michigan. As the Confederate attack lapped around the flank and towards their rear, Dickey and another officer tried to refuse the line, tried to bend it back to face this new threat. Joshua Chamberlain's not the only one that knows how to refuse a line. His classmate and brother in arms, George Hay, watched Dickey and this other officer try to accomplish this, as, quote, overwhelming numbers of rebels flanked Dickey and his company. Dickey was shot and instantly killed at the time, the fatal gunshot wound to his head. He was the first officer in the regiment to be killed at Gettysburg, and his remains were later reinterred in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. You can see an image of his headstone there this evening. Our non-traditional soldier that joined the 24th Michigan in his 40s, Abel Peck, the man that had lost 2 wives and 2 daughters in childbirth, that had received that $100 anonymous cash bounty because he was going to take the colors into battle when he enlisted in the 24th Michigan in 1861. By July 1st, Peck had been with the 24th Michigan as its color bearer for almost a year. Upon moving into Herbst Woods, or McPherson's Woods, Color Sergeant Abel Peck was shot through the forehead by a Confederate skirmisher. He was the first of the 24th Michigan to be killed that fateful day. Commanding the regiment, Colonel Henry Morrow said of Sergeant Peck, quote, I had lost my color bearer, Abel G. Peck, a brave and faithful soldier. He was one of 4 of the regiment's color bearers that were killed on July 1st. Another 3 were wounded. By the time the Iron Brigade would be able to go back out to their position and start burying their dead, it had been 5 days since the fighting occurred on McPherson's Ridge and in Herbst Woods lot. Many of those men had simply, the decomposition process had occurred so rapidly that their defining characteristics were gone. And friends and comrades and family members that knew these guys intimately were unable to identify many of them. As such, Color Sergeant Abel Peck would later be buried in the National Cemetery here at Gettysburg as an unknown. Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens, this was the guy in the 1850s that was looking for adventure, went to Australia for 3 years. During the fighting in McPherson's Woods, down on its western slope near Willoughby Run, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens received his mortal wound in the left side and bowels, probably from a member of the 14th Tennessee. Stevens would linger several days and finally passed away at the 1st Division 1st Corps Hospital on July the 5th. Initially, he would be buried in the town's private cemetery, the Evergreen Cemetery. The newspaper, the Daily Milwaukee News, reported just 2 weeks after the battle that, quote, his remains are on the way to Fox Lake, where his family resides. Several other newspaper accounts also stated that his remains would be, quote, removed at some future day to Wisconsin. But for reasons unknown, they were never claimed and never shipped back home. They would be moved from Evergreen Cemetery into the Wisconsin plot of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. When Stevens died on July 5th, he left his wife, Harriet, and 2 children, aged 3, Walter, and aged 1, Lucy, behind in Fox Lake, Wisconsin. There are moments when you can see how one event can radically change the outcome of somebody's life. And the reason why I've structured the program tonight the way that I have is to move beyond just the Iron Brigade was here at Gettysburg, let's go see where they fought. Really learn who these men were. The death of Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens would radically change his wife and his 2 children and their lives for the remainder of their lives. Now, upon his death, Harriet would apply and receive a widow's pension until she remarried, as per pension policy. Upon her new marriage, her pension payments were thus stopped in August of 1868. So she marries within 5 years of George's passing. 2 young kids, needing someone to provide for the family, can understand why she remarried very quickly. In 1885, 17 years later, she asks the federal government to restore her widow's pension for her first husband, due to the fact that she is divorcing this man that she married in the wake of the death of George. I'll read to you from her official application, from her asking the federal government for her pension to be restored. She's letting the federal government know that she has now divorced her second husband. She's going to retake her maiden name of Stevens. She would like that pension to be restored. And I'm going to share with you, it's a lengthy quote, but the reason why her life is so radically changed by the death of George and why she has to reapply for this pension. Her second husband's name was James McMahon. Quote, James McMahon appeared to be and had the reputation of being a respectful and industrious man, but he proved to be a hard-drinking man, which habit grew upon him, and he finally became a confirmed drunkard, on account of which he entirely failed to support or contribute to the support of his wife and their infant child, born to them Christmas Day, 1880, and abused and neglected them for the month of October, 1880, since which time the claimant has been entirely supported, together with her said child, by her own exertions and the assistance of her friend. That said, the claimant, Harriet, is now about 50 years old, with no property and no means of support, except her own exertions and the assistance of friends. And on that account of his said habitual drunkenness and failure to support Harriet and her said infant child, she was duly divorced from her said husband, and the custody of her said infant child awarded to her, and her name duly changed and restored to that of her former husband, George Stevens. Things go from bad to worse for Harriet. On June the 15th, 1915, while she is away from home, someone breaks into her house, steals everything worth value. And one of the things they steal is her purse. And in her purse contains her large pocketbook that contained many valuable papers, including her pension certificate that she used to draw that payment every month. And now she had to go back through this process with the federal government of trying to get the claim number and new paperwork sent all the while as an elderly woman, unable to take care of herself and with no income. Harriet would pass away just several years later. But you can see how the death of her first husband radically changed the trajectory of her life. It was more than just the Iron Brigade. These were individuals. There in the 2nd Wisconsin, alongside George Stevens, was Corny Wheeler. Now, Corny was nearly killed during the defense of Seminary Ridge, the last bastion of the 2nd Wisconsin's position late on the afternoon of July 1st. But he would survive the war. On May 25th of 1864, he'd be promoted to first lieutenant, and he would muster out just a month later in June of 1864. He musters out, he goes back home to Wisconsin. Now what? Any semblance of his former life is strained. He's been in war for the last 3 years. So, looking for employment, looking for something to do, just 2 months after going back home to Wisconsin, he heads south. And he's going to take a job as a civilian clerk in the United States Army Quartermaster's Department at Little Rock, Arkansas. He would work there for the next 2 years. Now, in addition to his quartermaster job, while he's down there in Little Rock, Arkansas, Wheeler decides to use some of his pay to invest. And he's investing in some abandoned cotton plantations in and around Little Rock, Arkansas. And with a small group of Northern associates, these men go in on trying to make money from this abandoned cotton plantation. Let's grow the cotton, let's get it picked, let's get it processed. I can do this on the side while working for the quartermaster's department. Well, it was essentially a pyramid scheme, and it collapsed. And it left him broke. He left even poorer from Little Rock than when he arrived there 2 years earlier. He would finally head back to Wisconsin in 1867. Once he's there, he falls in love, marries a girl, and he's given a position in his new father-in-law's banking business in Portage. He would later serve as the city treasurer in Portage, and he became an adjuster and general agent for the Northwestern Fire Insurance Company in 1875. This work would keep him traveling around much of the Midwest, which for Wheeler was great because he was then able to stop in and visit many of his comrades that he had served with during the American Civil War. In 1892, Corny was appointed as the governor of the Northwestern branch of the National Soldiers' Home. Think of it as retirement homes for Civil War veterans. It was an institution for disabled volunteer soldiers and sailors that was located in Milwaukee. In an interview after his appointment, he told the Milwaukee Sunday Telegraph on January 2nd, 1892, quote, "While I am glad to have been deemed worthy of promotion at the hands of my superiors, there is nothing which I look back to with so much pleasure or with greater satisfaction than the fact that when I was a boy, I enlisted as soon as I could, and that I served most of my time in the ranks." It was a position that Corny relinquished just 2 weeks before his death on January 13th, 1915. Now to my Ohioans, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes. Dawes is leading the 6th Wisconsin to the battlefield on the morning of July 1st. They're the last regiment of the Iron Brigade in line. The rest of the Iron Brigade's been funneled into fighting into Herbst's Woods, or McPherson's Woods. When a staff officer rides up to Dawes and tells Dawes the regiment is to be held in reserve. If we need more help with the fighting in Herbst's Woods, McPherson's Woods, you'll be called upon and sent in. But right now, you're going to stay here and wait. Dawes orders his men to lay down and wait for further orders. Now, just north of their position on the other side of the Chambersburg Pike, another Union brigade commanded by Lysander Cutler, who at one point in time was an officer in the Iron Brigade. He was being outflanked and driven from the battlefield, and Cutler would send for help to the 6th Wisconsin. Cutler knew Dawes, from the time that the men served together in the 6th Wisconsin, and knew Dawes could be relied upon. Cutler continued, quote, "Forming them rapidly perpendicular to the line of battle on the enemy's flank, I directed them to attack immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, their commander, ordered a charge which was gallantly executed. Dawes' men of the 6th Wisconsin, aided by the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, would capture a position that has become known as the unfinished railroad cut. They would take over 230 prisoners, and Dawes would continue to maintain command of the regiment throughout the duration of the fighting. After Gettysburg, during the fall of 1863 and the winter of 1864, Dawes returned to Marietta, Ohio, and married his sweetheart, Mary Gates. He would muster out in August of 1864 and return to Marietta for good. He would write, quote, "I am fairly heartsick at the stories of blood I hear from the old regiment," after leaving his unit. He said, "It seems almost certain to me that I could never have lived through another such carnival of blood. Only 80 men are left in the ranks for service." His first child, Charles, was born in August of 1865. One of the great parts of the Dawes family, not only does William Dawes ride with Paul Revere, not only does Rufus Dawes lead a regiment in the Iron Brigade to such fame and notoriety, but his firstborn son, Charles, would not only later just earn the Nobel Peace Prize, he would be Vice President of the United States in the Calvin Coolidge administration. In all, Mary and Rufus would have a total of 4 sons and 2 daughters. Dawes would stay in Marietta at this house that he built after the war, still standing today. Generally, he prospered in various businesses. He was a trustee of Marietta College. He served a single term in the U.S. House of Representatives. And in late 1881, while Dawes was working on his memoir, Dawes visited Arlington National Cemetery to, quote, "worship at the shrine of the dead." His mission to go to Arlington was to find the graves of, quote, "my friends and comrades, poor fellows who followed my enthusiastic leadership in those days, followed it to the death, which I, by a merciful providence, escaped." You imagine, 20 years after going off to war, you go in search of men who you commanded in combat that didn't get to go home. He would go on to locate nearly 24 graves of men of the 6th Wisconsin among the 16,000 that were already buried in Arlington by 1881, including several of the men who 20 years earlier, on a spring evening in Wisconsin, had signed the promise with Dawes to put their lives on the line for the country. Dawes was just 42 years of age when he visited Arlington. Yet he felt old, like he had lived 1,000 lifetimes. Upon his visit, he wrote this. He said, "The shadows of age are rapidly stealing upon us. Our burdens are like the loaded knapsack on the evening of a long and weary march, growing heavier at every pace. The severing of the links to a heroic and noble young manhood, when generous courage was spurred by the ambitious hope, goes on. You have lived to see spring up, as the result of your suffering, toil, and victory, the most powerful nation of history and the most beneficial government ever established." As a kind of benediction, Dawes would write, "This is your abundant and sufficient reward." Dawes would live to see his memoir published and was just 61 years of age when he died in Marietta in 1899. Our last soldier this evening that we were introduced to earlier was Sergeant Francis Jefferson Coates. Coates would be wounded during the fighting on July 1st when a, quote, "ball passed through and destroyed both his eyes, entirely blinding him." His ordeal in combat was not done, however. Lying wounded on the field, completely blind, and bleeding profusely from the wound, soon Sergeant Coates was left behind in no man's land. Confederate soldiers tried to rob him of anything of value and use. The blinded and wounded sergeant successfully beat back these enemy soldiers and was eventually able to make his way to a field hospital. I mean, can you imagine being shot in the head by a bullet that goes behind your, behind both of your eyes, severing your optical nerves, being left behind on the battlefield blind, being beat up and trying to be things robbed out of your pocket, while a fight is going on, and have to get yourself out of that combat situation. And he does. And he makes it back for treatment. Later, a compassionate Confederate officer is where he found his treatment would later fall in Confederate hands. The compassionate Confederate officer would help guide him around. Sergeant Coates, following the Battle of Gettysburg after the retreat of the Confederate Army, would be moved to Satterlee General Hospital in Philadelphia, and he would remain there until he was discharged on September the 1st, 1864. So you have this young man, Sergeant Coates, right? He's 20 years, well, not even 20 yet, 19 years old. He's blinded. There are only two things he knows how to do in life: farm and be a soldier. The Army says, we're done with you. There's nothing more we can do for you. We discharge him from the Army and send him home. What's he going to do? When he returns back to civilian life, one of the things he does is he learns how to make brooms. He teaches himself how to make brooms, and he will sell the brooms. And it's from the money that he raises from that endeavor that he is eventually not only to feed himself, but a growing family. 3 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Medal of Honor would be bestowed upon Jefferson Coates. His citation recognizes the ferocity with which he fought, stating, quote, unsurpassed courage in battle where he had both eyes shot out, end quote. He would marry in April of 1867, and the couple would have 5 children within the first 6 years of their marriage. In 1873, the family would pack up and leave Wisconsin forever, moving to Dorchester, Nebraska. There he would succumb to pneumonia on January 27, 1880, at just age 36. And he would be buried in the Dorchester City Cemetery. Through the stories of these 7 men tonight, we peered back through the nickname, we peered back through the mythology, we peered back through the casualty statistics that this unit suffered here at Gettysburg and on other battlefields of the American Civil War. And although the Iron Brigade is well known today, many paintings have been painted depicting the Iron Brigade. We've seen some of them. There's been movies, like the movie Gettysburg, that features the Iron Brigade in it. And numerous books by historians have gone on at length at various aspects of the Iron Brigade. Despite all of that popularity in the American consciousness today, in the 21st century, and indeed during the second half of the 20th century, from the 1950s forward, despite all of that, in the aftermath of the war, many Iron Brigade veterans came to believe that their service at Gettysburg was overlooked and largely forgotten. And it's easy to understand when you think about it. Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, they're really far from the East Coast. They're really far from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many of the big veteran reunions of the Army of the Potomac and the Grand Army of the Republic, many of these big veteran reunions are happening in Philadelphia, New York, and D.C. You heard some of these men that I told you that survived the battle, survived the war, they moved out to Nebraska. That's a huge trip to get from Nebraska to Philadelphia for a weekend veterans reunion. So they're not actively or not actively trying, but there's challenges to them to participate in this active and growing veterans organizations and veteran societies after the Civil War. On top of that, the only Western brigade in the Army of the Potomac, the Eastern Theater Union Army, received little notice in the history of the war that was being written in the 1870s and the 1880s. James Sullivan, known as Mickey, pick up his memoirs. Hilarious. He's a plucky young Irishman. One of the best reads you'll ever read from a soldier of the Civil War. Sullivan would write about this very issue in 1883. In particular, Sullivan, who was with the 6th Wisconsin, was concerned that the charge of the 6th Wisconsin and the capture of the railroad cut was completely ignored in the history of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War. He said that their charge against the railroad cut by 1883 was, quote, forgotten by all, except the few veterans and cripples, and the wives and mothers who lost all they held dear. But perhaps it was Corporal Charles H. McConnell of the 24th Michigan who was so prophetic when he uttered these words. And this is how we will close the program this evening. But in future years, the public appreciation of the Iron Brigade will grow and intensify. And the title to the greatest reverence and honor will be, he fought at Gettysburg. And in an exalted degree, he fought in the Iron Brigade at Gettysburg. 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Corps, 1st, and heroism always. Thank you.